I have been a minister of the gospel for 41 years, and in that time I have seen a great many things that the Lord arranges without consulting anyone's opinion of his methods. I have seen hard men softened by a child's hand, and soft men hardened by a winter too long. I have seen fortunes won on a card and lost on a flood. I have seen women of no particular consequence, by the world's reckoning, do the one thing at the one moment that turned the whole machinery of a man's life in a direction he never expected and could not have found on his own. I am speaking of Nora Gale. I am speaking of the winter of 1883, in the town of Milhaven, on the high plains of the Wyoming Territory, when the temperature dropped to 18 below on Christmas Eve, and a stranger appeared at the door of my church with ice in his beard and no particular story he cared to tell. And I am speaking of what that woman did for him, and what came of it, and how a man I had always thought too large and too armored to be cracked open by anything short of catastrophe turned out to be undone, completely and without remedy, by a coat and a supper basket, and a single act of grace offered without expectation of return. I have told this story to my congregation once, from the pulpit, in the summer of 1884. I told it without names because it was not mine to tell with names. But the two people it concerned were sitting in the front pew, and when I finished, Nora reached over and took Calhoun's hand without looking at him, and he sat very still and looked at the floor the way a man does when he is not going to cry but is working at it, and I thought that was probably the finest sermon I ever preached, even though I hardly said a word that was mine. Now I am old and they are settled, and I believe the story deserves to be told straight through, so I will tell it. Christmas Eve of 1883 came in on a north wind that had been building for 3 days. By the afternoon, the drifts along the main street of Milhaven were chest-high against the storefronts, and the ranchers who had ridden in for supplies were staying the night whether they planned to or not, their horses blanketed in Ira Keller's livery and their boots drying by whatever fire they could find. I had held the Christmas Eve service at 4 o'clock, earlier than usual, so that people could get home before dark made the roads impossible. By 5, the church was empty except for Nora. She was always the last to leave. She played the organ for the services, had done since her husband Martin died 2 winters before, and she'd taken the position partly for the small stipend and partly, I think, because the playing was the 1 hour of the week when nothing was required of her but to be present in the music. After the congregation filed out, she would sit at the keys a while longer, playing softly for herself, and I would go about my closing duties and not interrupt her. That evening she played for perhaps 20 minutes after the last boot heel disappeared out the door. I could hear it from the vestry, a carol I did not recognize, slow and plain, the kind of melody a person makes up when they are not quite aware they are playing at all. I was banking the vestry stove against the night when I heard the knock. It was not a confident knock. It was the knock of a man who has been standing outside working up to it, and who is not sure he deserves to be answered. 3 slow, heavy raps on the oak door, and then silence. I set down the iron poker and went to the front. He was standing just inside the vestibule when I opened the inner door. He had pushed the outer door himself, I suppose, when the cold became critical enough. A tall man, broad across the shoulders, wearing a canvas duster that had been good quality once and was now stiff with ice from the collar to the hem. His hat was pulled low, dark felt, snow-caked along the brim. His beard was frozen in places, little points of ice along the jaw. His hands, when he pulled them from his pockets, were the hands of a man who had been working outdoors in that weather for hours. He looked at me and said, "I'm not looking for charity." His voice was hoarse, either from cold or from disuse, I couldn't tell which. "I just need to be out of the wind for an hour. I'll go when I've warmed up." "You'll stay until the storm breaks," I said, "and sit down before you fall down." I am a small man and not physically imposing, but 40 years of ministry gives you a certain tone of voice that tends to settle the question. He looked at me another moment, then nodded once and came in. Nora had heard the door and come up from the organ. She stood at the end of the center aisle, her coat already on. She'd been about to leave, and she looked at the man the way a sensible frontier woman looks at a stranger in a difficult situation, taking his measure calm, not alarmed but not careless either. The stranger saw her and stopped. He was not, I think, expecting to find a woman there. "Mrs. Gale," I said, "this is a traveler in some difficulty. I'm going to get the vestry fire going again. Would you mind sitting with him a moment while I do?" It was not the most graceful introduction I ever made, but Nora was not a woman who required grace. She looked at the man for another 2 seconds, then said, "Come sit down," in the same voice she used to quiet children who were frightened, and turned and walked back toward the vestry, and after a moment's hesitation, the stranger followed her. I built the fire back up and went to see about some supper. We kept a small pantry in the church for the days when I or the deacons worked late, and on Christmas Eve there was more than usual. Mrs. Hanford had left a covered pot of soup and half a loaf of bread that afternoon, and there was a tin of coffee. I brought it through and set it on the vestry table, and when I came back with the second load, I stopped in the doorway for a moment without either of them noticing. Nora had set her own supper basket on the table beside the soup pot. She had been bringing a basket home. I could see from the cloth it was the kind of basket a woman packs when she has been cooking for a holiday and wants to bring something nice to an empty house. She had her thermos of cider on the table beside it, and she was unwrapping a portion of corn bread and a wedge of hard cheese and setting them in front of the stranger with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a woman who has fed hungry people before and does not consider it an event. The stranger was watching her. He had his hands around the tin cup of coffee I'd left, and he was watching her the way a man watches something he cannot quite account for, not rudely, not calculating, just with a careful, quiet attention, as though he was trying to understand something. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't," Nora said. She sat down across the table and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot. "Eat before it cools. The wind'll pick back up around midnight." He ate, not ravenously, but steadily and with evident need, and he did not talk while he did it. Nora did not push conversation. She drank her coffee and occasionally looked at the stove, and once she got up and added a piece of wood without being asked. I came and went, attending to what needed attending to, and when I passed through the vestry, the second time the stranger had finished eating and was sitting back with his hands around a second cup of coffee, and some of the locked quality had gone out of his face. "Cold trip?" Nora asked. "Longer than I planned," he said. "Where are you headed?" He was quiet a moment. "North," he said. "I have a property up near Harlow Flats." I knew Harlow Flats. It was a hard day's ride in good weather, too in bad. The man had no business being on the road in a storm like this one. "You'll not make Harlow Flats tonight," I said from the doorway. "No," he agreed. He looked at his coffee. "I know it. I thought I could beat the weather. I was wrong." Nora looked at him for a moment with that calm, assessing look of hers. Then she said, "There's a room above the hardware store. Walt Prout keeps it for his brother when he comes through, but his brother won't be coming through in this. I can speak to Walt in the morning." "I can pay for a room," the man said. It had a slight edge to it, the dignity of a man who is accustomed to not needing help. "I know you can," Nora said, in the same easy tone she'd used before. "I'm telling you where to find one." He looked at her. There was something in his eyes in that moment that I noticed and filed away and did not fully understand until later. Not gratitude, exactly, though that was in it. Something more like recognition, the look of a man who has been spoken to as an equal and is not entirely sure what to do with it. He stayed the night in Walt Prout's room above the hardware store, because Nora went and knocked on Walt's door in the storm and arranged it, and Walt, who was a decent man, said of course. Before the stranger left the church that night, Nora took the coat off her own back, her heavy winter coat, wool, with the sheepskin lining that had been Martin's before he died, and handed it to him. He looked at it and said, "I can't take your coat." "The duster's frozen through," she said. "You'll be all right from here to Walt's in it, but come morning you'll need wool. I have another at home." She did not. I knew she did not. She had a barn coat that was adequate for short trips and would not be adequate for anything longer. But she held the coat out with the same practical, unstoppable quality she brought to everything, and after a moment he took it. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Gale," she said. "Good night." He went out into the snow. I stood at the vestry window and watched him walk down the empty street with the sheepskin coat over the frozen duster, and Nora stood beside me for a moment before she put on her shawl and began wrapping up the remainder of her basket. "He didn't give his name," I said. "No," she said. "Doesn't that bother you?" She considered this. "Not particularly," she said. "Cold is cold, hungry is hungry. I didn't need his name for any of it." She said good night, pulled her shawl tight, and went out into the storm. I watched her go, small and straight against the dark and the wind, and I thought, Lord, there goes a woman of uncommon quality, and I hoped the world would have the sense to treat her accordingly. It had not been doing a very good job of it up to that point. I should tell you about Nora, because the story does not make proper sense without her. She had come to Milhaven 6 years before in the summer of 1877 with her husband Martin Gale, who was a carpenter and a quiet, good-natured man with no particular vices and no particular fortune. They had homesteaded a claim on 40 acres at the eastern edge of the Milhaven Valley, a piece of ground that was not the richest in the territory but was level and well-watered, and had a good stand of timber at the northern edge. Martin had built a house on it, a solid one by frontier standards, 2 rooms, a plank floor, a stone chimney, and they had put in a kitchen garden and a small orchard and were, by any reasonable measure, making a go of it. Martin died in the winter of 1881, not dramatically. He took sick in November and was gone by January, quietly and with a minimum of complaint, which was consistent with everything else about him. He left Nora the house and the 40 acres and a small debt to the Milhaven Cattlemen's Bank, which she had been paying down steadily from her organ stipend and from taking in sewing work. The trouble began with a surveyor named Driscoll. In the spring of 1883, a man named Chester Aldgate, who ran the largest cattle operation in the southern half of the valley, and who had for some time been interested in the timber stand at the northern edge of Nora's claim, hired Driscoll to resurvey the boundary between his land and hers. Driscoll came back with a line that moved the boundary 112 feet to the south, which by a remarkable coincidence placed the entire timber stand on Aldgate's side, and which also, by a further coincidence, raised the assessed value of Nora's remaining claim to an amount just above the unpaid balance of her bank loan. Chester Aldgate then bought the loan from the Milhaven Cattlemen's Bank for its full face value, and began making very precise and businesslike noises about the terms of repayment. The town council, of which Aldgate was the dominant member, convened in early December to consider the matter. The surveyor's line had been filed with the county. The loan was in Aldgate's name. The law, as Aldgate had arranged it, was entirely on Aldgate's side. 3 days after Christmas, the council was to meet again and make the foreclosure formal. Nora knew all of this. She had known it for weeks. She did not speak of it at the church, and she did not ask anyone for help because she was not a woman who performed her difficulties for an audience. She went about her work, the sewing, the organ, the kitchen garden on the days when it was warm enough, and she brought a basket of food to the Christmas Eve service at my church because that was what she always did on Christmas Eve, and she was not going to stop doing it because a man named Chester Aldgate had decided he wanted her timber. This is the thing about Nora Gale that I want you to understand before I go any further. She did not give that stranger her coat and her basket because she was not paying attention to her own situation. She gave them because she was paying very close attention to his, and because she was the kind of woman who, once she saw what needed doing, did it without stopping to calculate what she could afford. She could not afford the coat. She gave it anyway. That is the whole of her character in one act, and if you understand that you understand everything that follows. I did not see the stranger again until Sunday. He appeared at the morning service on the 28th of December, not Christmas Sunday, the Sunday after, when most of the visiting ranchers had cleared out and the congregation had settled back to its usual numbers. He came in quietly near the end of the opening hymn and took a seat in the last pew on the left. He had shaved. He was wearing a good suit, better than I would have expected from the frozen drifter of Christmas Eve, and the sheepskin coat was folded over his arm. I saw Nora notice him from the organ bench. She gave no sign of it beyond a slight hesitation at the turn of a phrase, so slight that no one who was not watching for it would have caught it. Then she finished the hymn and folded her hands in her lap. After the service, I went to speak to him, as I do with anyone I do not know. He was standing at the back of the emptying church, watching Nora speak with a pair of young mothers near the front, and he turned when I approached with an expression that was alert and composed and told me very little. "Aldous Fenn," I said, and offered my hand. He shook it. "Briggs," he said. "Calhoun Briggs." I knew the name. Most people in the Wyoming Territory knew the name, though what most people knew was the business side of it. The Briggs cattle operation out of Harlow Flats was one of the 4 or 5 largest in the territory, and Calhoun Briggs had a reputation as a man who ran a tight outfit and paid fair, and was not, under any circumstances, to be crossed in a land matter. He had been involved in 2 or 3 disputes over grazing rights in the years prior, and the disputes had all resolved in his favor, not because he was dishonest, but because he was thorough and patient and very, very good at understanding what the law actually said. None of this showed on his face at that moment. He was simply a well-dressed man with careful eyes, standing in the back of a small frontier church, watching a woman he had met once in a vestry storm. "You stayed," I said. "The road to Harlow Flats was still drifted yesterday," he said. "I'll head out tomorrow." "The congregation is generally glad to have visitors," I said. He looked at me. There was something in his expression that might have been amusement or might have been something else. "I imagine they are," he said. I introduced him to a few people. He was polite and spare with words and gave away nothing except his name, which people recognized with varying degrees of reaction. Chester Aldgate, who was in the congregation that morning. He was, irritatingly, a regular attendee, as though he believed the Lord approved of his methods, straightened slightly when he heard the name, and I saw him calculate something behind his eyes, but he did not approach. Nora approached. She came up with the directness she brought to most things and looked at Calhoun Briggs with a frank, calm appraisal. "You stayed," she said, echoing me without knowing it. "The road," he said. "Yes," she looked at the coat over his arm. "I'm glad it kept you." He held it out. "I meant to return it Christmas morning. I'm sorry I missed you." "Keep it through the winter," she said. "You can return it in the spring." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Gale," he said, "I don't think you have another coat." A pause, something shifted in Nora's face, not embarrassment exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been seen more clearly than they expected. "I have a barn coat," she said. "That's not a coat," he said. "That's a statement of intent." There was a moment of silence, and then Nora laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised and genuine, and the sound of it in that cold church was, I will tell you honestly, one of the finest things I had heard in some years. "Keep it through the winter," she said again, composed. "Good day, Mr. Briggs." She walked away. He watched her go, and the look on his face in that moment was the look of a man who has just witnessed something he cannot explain, and is not going to try to explain, and is going to be thinking about for a long time. He rode out the next morning. He did not say goodbye to me. He did not speak to Nora again before he left. The town council convened on the 28th, as planned. Aldgate presented the surveyor's findings. The council accepted them. The foreclosure was formally initiated with a 30-day clock set on the repayment of the note. 30 days from December 28th was January 27th. I told Nora that evening. She sat in my study for a moment and looked at her hands and said, "Yes." I knew it was coming. Then she said, "I don't suppose there's anything to be done," not as a question, but as a statement she was testing the weight of. And I said, "Not through the council," and she said, "No," and went home. On the 2nd of January, a rider came into Milhaven from the north. He was not Calhoun Briggs. He was a lean young man named Tolliver who worked for the Briggs outfit, and he stopped first at the county land office, where he spent the better part of an hour with the clerk, and then at the offices of the surveyor Driscoll, where he spent somewhat longer. I did not know any of this until later. What I knew at the time was that on the morning of January 3rd, when I went to the land office to post a notice about the Sunday service, the clerk, a nervous man named Purvis, seemed unsettled in a way that he would not explain. On the 4th, Calhoun Briggs himself rode back into Milhaven. He was not alone. He came with 2 men, not hired hands, or not only hired hands. They had the look of men who knew how to read documents as well as ride ranges. He took a room at the hotel again, and that afternoon I saw him going into the offices of Ezra Macomber, who was the only attorney in Milhaven and who handled most of the property work in the county. I did not approach him. Whatever he was doing, it was not my business, and I had learned in 40 years of ministry that the Lord generally manages things better without being assisted by well-meaning ministers who involve themselves prematurely. I watched from a polite distance and prayed and minded my own affairs. I did not mention any of this to Nora. On Sunday the 6th, Briggs was at the service again, last pew left side. He did not approach Nora after the service. He spoke briefly with Macomber, who was also in the congregation, and then with a man I did not recognize who had come in from out of town. Chester Aldgate was not there that Sunday. He had sent his regrets, according to his wife, who was. I noticed her eyes go to Briggs and stay there a moment before she looked away. After the service, as the church emptied, Briggs waited until most people had gone and then came to find me. We sat in the front pew, which is the place I always use for conversations that deserve a degree of quiet. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to tell me the truth." "That is generally the most efficient arrangement," I said. A slight pull at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Gale," he said, "is she all right? I mean, is she managing?" I looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've been asking some questions," he said. "About the land matter, the Aldgate situation." He paused. "The surveyor's line is fraudulent. I've had 2 independent surveyors look at the original filings. The corner markers were moved. The line that Driscoll filed would fail in any county court in the territory." I was quiet for a moment. "Does she know this?" "No," he said. "She doesn't have the money to hire a surveyor, and even if she proved the line was wrong, she still has the note to clear. Aldgate bought the loan and set the terms. Even if she wins the land dispute, she loses the house in 30 days. "Then what are you telling me?" I said. He looked at the altar. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I began to understand what I was watching, a man having a conversation with himself that had been going on for several days, and that I was merely being allowed to witness the tail end of. "I'm telling you," he said, "that I'm going to speak with the bank, with Macomber. With the county clerk." He paused. "And then I'm going to need you to not tell her where it came from." I looked at him. "Mr. Briggs," I said, "I have been a minister for 41 years, and in that time I have found that the anonymous benefactor is a very satisfying notion and a very complicated practice. People tend to find out, and when they do, it matters enormously whether they feel helped or managed." He absorbed this. "What would you suggest?" "I would suggest," I said carefully, "that you think about what you actually want here, and that you be honest with yourself about what it is." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "I want her to keep her land." "Yes," I said, "and?" He did not answer that. He stood up, put on his hat, and went out. I will tell you now what I learned afterward, because at the time I learned only pieces. Calhoun Briggs had been born in Kentucky, the 3rd son of a farming family, and had come west in his 20s with nothing but a strong back and a particular quality of stubbornness that in a man who is also intelligent tends to produce results. He had built the Harlow Flats operation over 15 years, through drought and blizzard and 3 separate attempts by neighboring outfits to crowd him off range. He had legal right to, and he had prevailed in all 3 because he was methodical and unhurried, and because he had a very precise understanding of what the law said and what it did not say. He had been married. Her name was Clara, and she had died in the winter of 1878, and with her had died an infant son who had not lived long enough to be named. He had not remarried. The men who worked for him described him as a fair employer and a hard one, a man who did not ask more of his hands than he asked of himself, and who did not explain his decisions or invite opinions about them. He had come south that December not on business, but because he made a habit, each Christmas, of riding through some part of the territory that he did not know well, and spending a week or 2 in places where nobody knew his name. He said once, years later, that it was the only way he could be sure that what people gave him, a meal, a conversation, a moment of ordinary human courtesy, was actually for him and not for what he could do for them. He had come to Milhaven because a hand on his outfit had mentioned the church there had a particularly good Christmas service. He had gotten caught in the storm. He had knocked on the door because he was genuinely cold and had run out of better options. He had not expected Nora. What struck him, as he told me much later, was not any single thing she did or said. It was the quality of attention she brought to it, the complete absence of calculation. She had not asked who he was before she gave him the coat. She had not paused to weigh what she had against what he needed. She had simply looked at the situation, determined what it required, and provided it, with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. He had met women who were generous out of performance and women who were generous out of habit, and he had met very few women who were generous out of a kind of clear-eyed, uncomplicated goodness that did not seem to know it was anything remarkable. Nora was the last kind. And in a man who had spent 6 years behind walls of his own construction, it did something to him that he was not prepared for and could not quite account for. He had ridden back to Harlow Flats after that Sunday service and spent 3 days trying to talk himself out of what he was thinking. He had told himself it was gratitude, which was a manageable feeling with a manageable remedy. He had told himself the land situation was simply an injustice that any decent man would want to correct, which was also true. He had told himself he was reading too much into a single encounter in a storm. He had told himself he was 51 years old and had been doing perfectly well for 6 years without any of this. None of it worked. On the 3rd of January, he sent Tolliver south to look at the surveyor's filings. On the 4th, he followed. What he did in Milhaven between the 4th and the 15th of January, he did quietly, methodically, and in the order that a man of his particular stubbornness and precision would naturally choose. He engaged Maccomer to prepare a legal challenge to Driscoll's survey, backed by the findings of the 2 independent surveyors Tolliver had brought in. He had a conversation with the county clerk that I imagine was the kind of conversation a very large cattle baron with a very clear grasp of the law has with a county clerk who has been looking the other way on a fraudulent filing. And after that conversation, the clerk was considerably more cooperative than he had previously been. He paid a call on Chester Aldgate. I do not know exactly what was said at that meeting. Aldgate never spoke of it, and Briggs gave me only the outline. But I know that Aldgate had done business with the Briggs outfit in the past, and that there was a grazing rights matter between them that had never been fully resolved, and that Aldgate was not a stupid man. Whatever Briggs said, and however he said it, Aldgate came away from the meeting having agreed to transfer the loan note back to the Milhaven Cattlemen's Bank at face value, with a notation that the balance had been satisfied in full. He also came away having agreed to accept the county clerk's finding that Driscoll's survey was in error and that the original boundary would stand. He did not look happy about any of this. He looked like a man who has been shown, with surgical precision, exactly how far his leverage extends and where it stops. Nora received a letter from the bank on the 15th of January. It informed her that the note on her property had been marked paid in full, that the foreclosure proceedings had been terminated, and that the surveyor's boundary correction had been filed with the county, restoring her full 40 acres including the timber stand. The letter was signed by the bank president and contained no reference to how any of this had been arranged or at whose instigation. She came to see me that afternoon. She sat in my study with the letter in her hands and read it through twice, and then she looked up at me and said, "Aldous, what happened?" "It appears," I said carefully, "that the survey was found to be in error. And the note also resolved." She was quiet for a moment. "How?" It was not a question. She knew. Not the details, she could not have known the details, but she had the intelligence and the instincts of a woman who does not miss much, and she had been thinking about a certain man who had come to her church on a snowy Sunday and asked careful questions in a careful voice. "Mr. Briggs," she said. I said nothing. "Aldous," she said, "I am not in a position to confirm or deny." Aldous, her voice was quiet and exact. "Was it Calhoun Briggs?" I looked at my hands. "I think," I said, "that there are some people who would like a word with you on that subject, and I think they should be allowed to have it on their own terms." She sat with that for a moment. Then she folded the letter with the precise, controlled movements of a woman who is feeling a great deal and is not going to perform any of it in public. She put it in her coat pocket, the barn coat, I noticed. She had never replaced the sheepskin, and she stood up and said, "Where is he staying?" "The hotel," I said. She went out. What happened at the hotel that afternoon I know only from what both of them told me, at different times and in different proportions, and I have assembled it as best I can. I believe it to be accurate in the essentials, which is all that matters. Nora knocked on the door of his room, which the desk clerk had supplied without much resistance, and when Briggs answered, she looked at him for a moment and then said, "May I come in?" He stepped back and let her. She stood in the center of the room and looked at him with that clear, steady look of hers, and she said, "It was you." He said, "Yes." She was quiet. He waited. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The survey was fraudulent. Aldgate was taking land that wasn't his." "That's not the whole answer," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said, "it isn't." Another pause. She said, "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Briggs." "No," he said, "you're not. What you are is a woman who gave a stranger her last coat in a snowstorm and didn't ask for anything in return, and then she sent him on his way like it was nothing." He stopped. "It wasn't nothing to me." Nora was quiet for a long time. He waited, which I think was the right instinct. She said, finally, "I don't know what you want from this." "I'm not sure I know either," he said, "but I'd like the chance to find out if that's something you'd be willing to consider." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "I'm going home. It's nearly dark and I have a fire to lay." She went to the door. Then she paused with her hand on the frame and said, without turning, "There's coffee in the morning at 8 if you'd like to return the coat." She went out. He stood in the center of his hotel room, I imagine, for a few minutes, very still, in the way that a man stands when something has happened, and he is not yet sure of the shape of it, but he can feel that it is large. He came to her door the next morning at 8 o'clock with the sheepskin coat over his arm and stood on the porch of the small house on the eastern edge of the valley and knocked. Nora opened the door. She looked at him and then at the coat and then back at him, and she stepped back and let him in. She poured coffee. He sat at her kitchen table, the table Martingale had built, in the house Martingale had built, on the land that was properly hers again as of yesterday, and he put the coat on the bench beside him and wrapped his hands around the cup. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something baked, and the morning light came through the single east-facing window and lay across the table in a long, pale rectangle. They talked. I do not know all of what they said, but I know the general terrain of it, his life at Harlow Flats, her years in Milhaven, Martin, Clara, the infant son, the particular loneliness of a person who has built a good life and still finds something missing from it at odd hours of the evening. They talked for 2 hours, by Nora's account. He thanked her properly for the coat. She told him he was welcome. They finished the coffee. He stood to go. At the door he said, "Mrs. Gale, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I think you prefer plain speech." "I do," she said. "I'm not in the habit of making gestures," he said. "I don't give things that I don't mean. What I did with the land, I did it because it was right, and because you would have lost land that was yours because a dishonest man wanted your timber. That's the whole of one part of it. The other part is," he stopped. "The other part is that I would very much like to come back, if that's something you'd be willing to consider." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You could split the wood that's been sitting by the barn since October." He blinked. Yes, I could do that." "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. "Knock when you're done." She went back inside. He went around to the barn. There was indeed a pile of unsplit wood that had been sitting since October, because Nora's 2 main sources of wood splitting had been her husband and the neighbor boy who had moved away in the fall, and she had not yet found a replacement. He split wood for an hour and a half. When he knocked, she brought him out a plate of food and a cup of coffee and stood on the porch and looked at the split wood, which was good work, neatly done, and said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said. He rode back to Harlow Flats that afternoon. He came back the following week, and the week after that. I will not drag you through all of it, because a courtship that works is, in its daily mechanics, less interesting than a courtship that doesn't, and this one worked. They were both adults. They were both people who had learned, through difficulty, what mattered and what didn't. They did not have the leisure for the elaborate misunderstandings and retreats that younger people sometimes indulge in, and they were both too plain-spoken for them anyway. He came to Milhaven every week through January and February, sometimes staying 2 or 3 days, staying at the hotel and coming to her in the mornings. They ate together most evenings. She cooked. He helped with whatever needed doing, and they talked in the evenings the way 2 people talk when they are finding out whether they fit, which is differently from how people talk when they are trying to impress each other. There is less performance in it. More silence, comfortable silence, the kind that fills in gradually as 2 people become accustomed to each other. He met the difficulties honestly. He told her that he was not an easy man to know, which she said she had gathered. He told her that he had spent 6 years making himself self-sufficient in a way that had become habit, which she said she understood, because she had done the same. He told her that Harlow Flats was 3 hours' ride from Milhaven, which she said she knew, and that it was a large operation and not a quiet life. And she said she thought she could manage a large operation better than she could manage feeling, each winter, as though the walls were a little closer than the year before. She told him that she was not going to apologize for being the kind of person who gave away coats to strangers, and he said he had not asked her to, and she said good, because she intended to go on doing it. He said that he expected she would, and that he did not consider it a flaw. She looked at him when he said that with a look that I think was the moment she decided she trusted him, though she did not say so. In March he asked her to marry him. He did it at the kitchen table, over coffee, which was where they had most of their important conversations. He told her he was not going to pretend he understood all of what he felt, or that he could guarantee anything, but that he knew he had not wanted to come back from Harlow Flats every week because of the scenery. He told her that he thought, if she was willing, they could build something good. He told her he was 51 years old and had learned, at some cost, not to mistake what mattered for what was convenient. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You'll have to speak to Aldous." He said, "I'll speak to Aldous." She said, "And you'll have to understand that I'm going to keep the church position." "The organs." He said, "I wouldn't ask you not to." She said, "And I'll want the kitchen garden." He said, "There's room at Harlow Flats for a kitchen garden that would make yours look modest." She was quiet for another moment. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she let him, and that, I think, was that. I married them on the 14th of June, 1884, in the church where she had given him her coat 6 months before. It was a morning service. The congregation was the largest I had seen at Milhaven in some years. Word had gotten around, because word always gets around in small frontier towns, and people came from 3 or 4 neighboring spreads to see it. Nora wore a dress she had made herself from good gray wool, which was not a wedding color in the traditional sense, but suited her precisely, practical and dignified and quietly beautiful, which was what she was. Calhoun wore his best suit and looked like a man who is navigating a large emotion with careful attention, which was also what he was. Chester Aldgate was not in the congregation. The ceremony was plain and short, because both of them preferred plain and short, and the vows were the old ones, the ones that have held up because they say what actually needs to be said without ornament. When I asked Calhoun if he would take this woman, he said yes in a voice that was completely steady, and I know what that steadiness cost a man of his particular reserve, and I respected it. When I asked Nora, she said yes and looked at him while she said it, directly and without flinching, the way she did everything. They were married. The congregation made the noises congregations make. Nora played the organ herself for the recessional, because she had arranged the music months before, and there was no one else in Milhaven whose playing she trusted for the specific piece she had chosen, which was the carol she had been playing the night a stranger knocked on the vestry door. The quiet, made-up one that I had heard and not recognized and had thought at the time was the sound of a woman playing for no one but herself. She played it straight through, beginning to end, while the congregation filed out into the June morning, and Calhoun stood at the back of the church and listened with his hat in his hands and that particular expression of a man who is feeling something too large for his face to accommodate. And when she finished and the last note went up into the rafters and disappeared, he walked up the aisle and offered her his arm, and she took it, and they went out together into the light. They left for Harlow Flats in late June. The house on the eastern edge of the Milhaven Valley, Martingale's house, the one with the plank floor and the stone chimney, was kept on because Nora would not sell it and because Calhoun did not press her. They leased it to a young couple who had come out from Ohio that spring and needed a start. The kitchen garden went with it. The timber stand stayed hers. She came back to play the organ most Sundays, making the 3-hour ride on Fridays and staying with a friend in town and riding home on Mondays. In the winter, when the passes were bad, she stayed a week or 2 at a time, and Calhoun came and got her when the weather cleared, and I would see him sometimes, tied up outside the church on a Sunday morning, waiting, just waiting, with the patience of a man who has learned that some things are worth the wait. She planted a kitchen garden at Harlow Flats, as promised. It was, I am told, considerably larger than the one at Milhaven. She took over the management of the house with the same brisk, unstoppable competence she brought to everything. And the men on the outfit, who had been skeptical in the way that cowboys tend to be skeptical of change, came around within a month, because she fed well and treated them decently and never confused knowing her own mind with failing to listen to theirs. Calhoun, for his part, changed in the ways that a man changes when the walls he has built around himself are no longer necessary, not quickly, because he was not a quick man, and not completely, because some of the walls had been load-bearing and removing them all at once would have caused structural problems, but steadily and in the right direction. He laughed more than he had. He slept better, which was a thing he mentioned only once to me and which I did not repeat. He put a small organ in the parlor at Harlow Flats, because Nora had mentioned once that she missed playing in the evenings, and he was the kind of man who, once he understood what was missing, did not wait to be asked twice. She cried when she saw it, which was one of the very few times I ever heard of Nora Gale crying, and she told me he had stood in the parlor doorway looking slightly alarmed, clearly uncertain whether the organ had been the right call, and she had said, still crying, "It's exactly right, you impossible man," and he had said, "Good," in the voice of a man who was deeply relieved, and that had been that. I am an old man now, and Milhaven is quieter than it was, and the winters seem longer. But I still think about that Christmas Eve, and the knock on the vestry door, and the woman who was the last one in the church because she always stayed to play a little longer. I think about the coat particularly. It was a wool coat with a sheepskin lining, and it had belonged to Martin Gale before he died, and Nora had worn it for 2 winters after that. It was the best coat she owned. She gave it to a stranger in a snowstorm without knowing who he was, because he was cold and her duster was frozen through, and because she was the kind of woman who, once she saw what needed doing, did it. He wore it back to Harlow Flats when they went in June. She packed it herself. I asked her once, years later, why she had packed it. It was Martin's coat, after all, and I would have expected her to find it complicated. She thought about it for a moment and then said, because Martin would have given it away himself. It was just waiting for the right stranger. I have thought about that answer a great many times. The right stranger. Not just any stranger, the one the coat was waiting for. As if things find their way, given enough patience and enough grace, to the person they were meant for. As if a woman who gives away her last coat without counting the cost is not diminished by the giving but is enlarged by it, and as if the man who receives such a gift carries, whether he means to or not, the obligation to become something worthy of it. I don't know if that is theology or just the way things work. Perhaps on the frontier there is not always much difference. I know that on the 14th of June, 1884, I stood at the altar of my church and said the words over 2 people who had earned each other, and that when the ceremony was done and the June light was coming through the windows and the organ was playing that quiet, made-up carol, I felt what I always feel at a true wedding, which is that the Lord has been at work here for longer than any of us knew, and that the work is good. The coat is still at Harlow Flats. I have seen it, hanging on a peg by the kitchen door. It is worn down to the lining now, past all usefulness as a coat, but Nora has never thrown it away. I imagine she never will. Some things are worth keeping, not because of what they are, but because of what they began.